So we were talking about contextual analysis, contextual design. It's the way of understanding users' needs, what's the barriers to doing things with the system that you're studying. And there's just some general recommendations or rules when you're interviewing people. The first one is to try and make sure that the person understands that you're testing a system and not testing a person. Because usually when people, are asked to do something, you're actually testing them, right? And if people think you're testing them, then they'll say, oh, I'm so stupid, I don't understand this, I'm not really the right person for you to be asking. So it's important to give them the right context, the right frame of mind to say things like, this system has some problems, we're asking you to help us find them, right? So to really get the person to understand that they are, remember we talked about collaborating, participating, that they are helping you testing the product, and you actually are hoping to find problems with it. And that way the person then will be helping you find problems rather than feeling nervous about not being able to do stuff. So that's always a useful thing to start off with. And the next thing we were talking about is the context. So if you've looked ahead at the kind of diagrams that you have to produce, one of them is called the social diagram or the cultural diagram. It's all about why people do stuff, what influences them to make the choices that they make, and what sort of opinions they have about the system, the product, the reason that they're doing things. It's all about the why things happen. So that won't necessarily come up as part of your standard interview, so you have to start with some questions. Yeah?
How is it common to actually manipulate information while actually telling that to users? I mean, is it common to say, if you don't represent an organization, to claim that you represent an organization or something like that?
Well, so I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Typically, pretty much any time you're doing user testing, you're getting people who you hope are representative of some group. And I mean, that's just inevitable. There's no way, you can't possibly test everybody. And so the goal is to get people who are like your target audience. I mean, for the purposes of this assignment, we particularly wanted everybody to get somebody who's going to have problems, which is not necessarily what you would do in real life, but we wanted everybody to be able to practice understanding how people have problems and why they have problems. So in another lecture, probably the last lecture, we're going to talk about something called personas, which is a way of understanding your target audience and dividing it into groups. And that it's a very common strategy to think about who are our target audience, how would we divide them into categories, and then you would definitely want to pick people from the various categories. Is that what you were asking about? Okay. But for the purposes of this assignment, you're just picking one from this category way off to the left or whatever that's people who are novices and won't understand things. Just kind of by way of making it a more educational experience for your first user study. So hopefully the people you pick won't be so far afield from the device that you're trying to do that they'll have some kind of answers for these or something relevant. So you're trying to find out when they would normally do this kind of thing or in what context they would do it. So if you have a camera and you give it to somebody, you'd say, well, what do you usually take pictures of? How do you decide whether to take pictures? Do you ever have somebody else asking you to take pictures, right? So you're trying to understand this device use in the context of the person's real lives. So that they shouldn't make stuff up, and you definitely can't make stuff up. But understanding kind of all this, what they call influences or the context, cultural context is important. And so you should start with some sort of simple questionnaire for your user before you get started in the actual use. We require in this assignment that you have a written script, a written set of questions, and this is not quite as important for a single user, but if you have lots of users and you ask them very different things, you'll get kind of different answers. And so if you're wondering how these people across the different personas differ, it's really important that you kind of say the same things to them. And the only way really to do that is to have a written script. And so you want to write down the instructions. And another reason to have a written script, to have written instructions, is to make sure you say things the right way. Okay? And you want to say them the same way every time. So one of the key errors that novices make is giving away the answer in the questions. So if you said, you know, can you push the search button? Everyone will look at the screen and find a button that says search and click on it, right? This isn't really a coordination test. And it's really not supposed to be a visual search test. So you wanted to know if they understand what to do. So you shouldn't give them the answers in the questions. So for example, use the hours and minutes buttons to set the time. That tells them how to do it. It tells them what buttons to press. That's the wrong way to give the instructions. If you said the clock should have the right time, right, now you're telling them what to do, but it doesn't give them any hint about how to do it. So one of the key reasons we want you to write down your instructions for this homework is to practice figuring out ways of asking the questions that don't give away the answers. Okay? And that's a really useful skill to have, and we want to make sure that you're doing that in your script. So you should write down the actual questions that you're going to ask, and then you should read them off of your piece of paper or whatever to the subjects. So we've also found that if you give the instructions to the user on a piece of paper, they just ignore them. So typically, especially, you're going to have a long list of questions, and they'll just kind of skim over it and say, OK, I'm ready. Now you can tell me what you want me to do. It sounds like it would be awkward, but it actually works out much better to just read what you've written down. And that they'll listen, they'll do what you tell them to, and you'll be careful. You'll be saying it the right way. We talked last time about having a variety of tasks. A bunch of people asked about this with respect to their homework. So unless you happen to have kind of an overarching task that's going to explore the whole interface, then typically you'd have different tasks for different parts. And we talked about that. Okay, one of the questions we often get is, you know, can I have some examples? So I put some right here in the lecture slides. So I don't think anybody has this. It's an old one anyway. So this is some of the contextual questions to get somebody in the right mood of using a GPS device, right? So how often have you used a GPS before? When do you use it? Who decides where you're going to go or what routes to take? How would you know? If you're confused about it, who would you ask? Okay, so this is all the kind of contextual questions to understand how people use things with respect to a GPS. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the previous slide, you said not to mention the product name.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for e-commerce websites, like last time we discussed, like if you want to ask the user to find ask on everything, you are mentioning the product
Right.
there, right?
So the trick is, the question is, you know, what to say if you can't say anything, right? I mean, that's really confusing. So the key thing is to try and think about what the user would definitely know, and what is the task that you care about, right? So if somebody has a bottle of aspirin in front of them that says Bayer aspirin, and they want a new one, right? Then they know the name. It says Bayer aspirin right on the bottle, right? And so saying to somebody, pretend you have a bottle of aspirin in your hand and you want more. You know, how would you use this website to find aspirin? So, you know, you're assuming that that's what they have in their head, and so it makes perfect sense to tell them about it. Alternatively, say you were wondering if this website is any good for finding out what to do about a headache, right? Then you wouldn't say, can you find aspirin for a headache, because that's giving away the answer. If you're interested to know if the website can answer that question, you can say, pretend you have a headache, what would you do? Can you find anything good for that in this website? Right? And so it depends on what particular tasks you have in mind. Right? And so like here, you know, if I'm trying to ask people, here, let's go to the next page. you know, can you find your way to Walmart? Well, that's assuming they have Walmart in their head already. So that may be a perfectly reasonable task, that you're wondering if this GPS can help people when they know where they want to go. Alternatively, can they find something by category? You know, if they need a store or they need to buy a swimming pool, you know, where would they go? You can, it's part of the planning for what sort of tasks you have in mind for your users and how you're going to cover different parts of the task, different parts of the website or whatever the device is. Anything else? So these, the top set are a set of questions that are try to get at a variety of tasks that this GPS is good for, and it should theoretically take around 15 to 20 minutes, maybe half an hour for a novice. So, you know, it's a collection of tasks. Oh, okay. And, you know, some of them are kind of vague and some of them are very specific. And, you know, hopefully, I mean, you're not trying to trick the user, so you wouldn't ask them to do something that's simply impossible with a GPS, right? So if this particular GPS really can't find the intersection of two streets, that would be kind of mean, right? So you're not trying to, you know, whereas Google does a perfectly good job at that, right? So depending on what your GPS will actually succeed at doing would depend on how you ask the questions. And so one of the parts of the homework says to describe the user, and you're not supposed to use people's real names because this is supposed to be anonymous. And so this is kind of an example of the kind of things that you might keep track of. You might reveal. Can I get rid of this box? Yeah. That would help you understand how she uses GPS. And all this would then be reflected in the social model as well. So another part of the assignment asks for a transcript. And this is supposed to be basically a summary of what happens. And it doesn't have to be word for word, okay, because that's obviously more detail than we really need. But it's important to include your questions so you can copy and paste them right from the script if you say them directly, and then kind of what happened as a result of that. And so these are, you know, he probably, on line 4, probably didn't say never used before, right? It's just a kind of a summary or generalization of what they actually said, a collapse of a few lines. Line numbering, it turns out Microsoft Word will do line numbering for you automatically. You can just turn it on. So you don't have to worry about time codes and things like that. So we're trying to make this as easy as possible while still giving the graders enough information so they can tell what really happened, so that we can tell if your diagrams match up. Okay?
So you're saying this is what you want instead of the number?
Time codes are fine. This is just easier. Yeah, so you know, if you've already started with time codes, definitely keep that. It's a little more accurate and a little more realistic in real life. This is just easier. You know, you can pick whichever one you want. Okay, so we're going to do a little practice contextual inquiry now. And I have to warn you that this video is kind of old. It's quite old, actually. But it does a great job of having lots and lots of breakdowns. It's also real in the sense that this actually happened to me when I recorded it. So when you're doing a kind of video or an observation, you're going to want to look at all these different kind of things. So obviously the context, why things happen, and then what causes things to happen. So let's see where to go here.
Okay.
Everyone here okay?
Why don't you tell us about what you're doing here?
Okay, my students told me that we needed to buy a new iPad handheld computer to replace the one that was stolen. And normally for real expensive computer purchases, I have the computing facility. Anybody know what an iPad is? It was a PDA. People heard of PDA? So it's a predecessor to smartphones. People buy it. And for really inexpensive things that are simple, I have my secretary buy it. But for handhelds, I like to do it myself to make sure we get the right unit. And normally I go to Computer Discount Warehouse, CDW, to buy them, so I thought I would start there.
Okay. Is that because the selection or the price or?
Yeah, I've had good luck with their reliability and also. Okay, so right at the beginning, I give all this context. You know, I usually, I buy things, student buy things, secretaries buy things, there's the purchasing department. So there's all these different groups involved. I said I usually use this website, CDW, and the experimenter is asking why, right? He didn't quite ask it in the right way because he was proposing some possible reasons. It would have probably been better to say, why did you pick CDW instead of some other site? Or something a little vague, right? So he said this, it was the price, it was the reliability, right? So you're kind of giving somebody hints, and you really want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So they seem to have pretty good prices.
Okay. So why don't you go ahead?
So I'm pretty sure what we want is the iPac 3870, so I thought I'd just type that into the search box and see if we could get to it directly. And unfortunately, it didn't find it. So let's see, maybe just type. Okay, so this was the first, two breakdowns. First one was pretty obvious. Didn't find what I was searching for, right? And the second one, it just did a ding noise. Did people hear the ding? What was the breakdown? Yeah?
Return.
Right. So I hit the return on the keyboard,
It didn't have the go button selected.
and so it dinged at me, right? What should it have done, or what did I expect it to do?
Search.
Just go ahead and do the search, right? Because I already typed stuff into enough of the fields. Now this isn't, you know, it's not like I didn't understand what was going on, or I was really confused, or it even took very much time. But it is a small annoyance, and you'll see it comes up again later. It's just so natural that you kind of would say, oh, that's silly, we should have made that work. So.
Now, when you're looking for something specific, is search usually the way that you would go about finding it?
It usually will go right to the right unit. So that makes it a lot easier, yes. Okay, so that was kind of a little interchange there. You know, I said I'm going to go to search right away, type something in, and so the experimenter is wondering how normally I would go and find the product that I want. Right? And so this is kind of the information that would be useful for you to understand how people you know, would normally want to use an interface. And I'm doing a pretty good job of narrating what I'm doing. Right? This is called think aloud protocols. So everything I'm thinking or trying to do, I'm saying it out loud. Typically, your users won't be as verbal. This won't be as natural to them to try and actually say everything that's happening. And so you'll probably have to prompt more with, you know, well, what are you trying to do now? What did you expect to happen? How did you know to type that in? You know, how did you pick which screen to go on? So lots of general questions to try and understand all of the steps. Okay, so I typed in my pack, and I have this really long list of different things. So the red are the categories. I'm going to try and find the category about handhelds. Here it is, handheld software. Okay, anybody catch what just happened? A little louder? Somebody? There's a breakdown just here, yeah?
Well, you have to go through the list to figure out specific thing to get it specifically you wanted.
Right. And there was a breakdown that just happened? Right. So I was looking for handheld computers, and this title says handheld computer software, right? So the key word here is actually software, because pretty much everything on this website are computers, and this whole list are handheld stuff, right? So the key word here is the last word. And so that's kind of a breakdown that kind of hints at, if you're going to have lots of categories, put the most important word first, right? Because then when people are scanning, then they'll get to the right information. And this is an awfully long list for things that are probably not that relevant to what I was searching for. But the company does sell a lot of different kinds of things.
H3878. So I guess maybe if I type that in, here it is.
Okay, so it's kind of mumbly and goes by pretty quick, and this is one of the reasons that we want you to record and get a transcript. So you remember I first did a search and it failed, right? So people are always trying to come up with theories about why the interface isn't doing what they're doing. It's called the user's mental model. And here I am articulating a hypothesis about why the search might have failed. You'll see it in the end, it turns out that it's just a really bad search engine. But I'm hypothesizing that I should have typed in the whole name instead of just part of the name, and maybe then it would have worked, right? And so this is another good kind of piece of information to capture of what is the user's mental model. What are they thinking the system's supposed to do for them?
I guess I'll go ahead and start buying it. One shipping. Okay, that's good.
Okay, so this is an example of something working well, right? I was wanting to review my order, and you saw the cursor go around. That's a pretty common situation when people are navigating an interface or reviewing some information. And everything I wanted to know was right there. It worked really well. So that's also something to capture occasionally, is if something seems to be particularly well done, you might as well make a note of it so you don't mess it up by accident or change it when you don't need to.
Okay, username and password. Well, I have to go look that up in a file. Let me bring that up. Maybe you could stop taking.
Okay. Okay, so while we were paused there, you pulled up, it looked like a big text file of all your usernames and passwords.
Right. I have so many that I can't remember them, so
Right.
I have them logged by the particular website that they go with.
And you just do a search for the name of the website.
Right. And then I did a copy and paste of my email address and my password for this particular site.
All right.
And I'll do a secure login.
So how many people have more than 10 emails and URLs or passwords and stuff for different websites? How about more than 100? I probably have more than 100. And if you probably checked, you probably do too. And nobody can keep track of them all, and everybody has a variety of not particularly recommended ways of dealing with it. And mine is to keep them all in a big text file and copy and paste them. And I didn't want that on the video, and so that's perfectly reasonable. If your user pulls out their credit card and types it in, you don't want to make a transcript of that. So it's, even though you're going to anonymize it, it makes sense to be sensitive to things that the user wants to keep secret or would rather not have shared. So that's a perfectly reasonable kind of thing to do. It probably won't affect your study.
You have entered an unknown username or incorrect password. Well, it wants a username, not an email address.
So how many people have had this happen to them? The site is a little ambiguous about which one it wants. Most modern websites will actually let you do an either, or it'll get rid of the idea of a username and let you just type in your email address. Because everybody's email address is globally unique, and usernames are a pain, unless you're in Facebook or something where you actually have to have a name. And another thing to notice is the error message was ambiguous. It said, you have typed in an illegal name or password. So the website obviously knows which one of those is wrong, but it's made the decision to not tell the user that, right? So it's a little more secure if it doesn't tell you which one is wrong. But this is like the only case where it's appropriate for websites to not tell you what they know, right? So if you have this big page full of things and it says, there's something wrong on this page, please fix it. It's like, that's really obnoxious, right? It should tell you what's wrong. This is kind of like the only situation where you wouldn't do that. Oops.
Try my username instead. Oh, the user.
So what happened there? I know you can't read this yet, but there was a long pause, even after the screen refresh. So one of the things you're observing is the nonverbal things that happen too. Okay, so what happened in this situation? Right. So I was looking somewhere around here where I typed in the information, and that, this website's kind of slow. So I was continuing to look in this area, and the error message appeared way up there. I didn't even notice it when it appeared, right? Because it was in a different part of the screen than I was looking. And so this is an example. And then I said, oh, because I was surprised that the data had already appeared. Right? So you're looking for these kinds of nonverbal, whenever the user's confused, they might be not doing something when it seems like they should be doing something. So this is another kind of thing that you should be on the lookout for.
Name and password required for CDWG. Please log on to CDWG.
No, what is that? You know what?
That's the special government and educational part of the website.
Okay.
I thought they were
So-
the same.
Looks
Okay,
like they have a different side to that.
Start over. Oh, no.
Okay, so what just happened?
You lost it.
Yeah, so the website, this website has two different parts for two different groups of customers. And it knew perfectly well that I had logged into the wrong one. What should it have done?
Should have transferred the information
Yeah.
that we had.
Obviously, it should have left me logged in, transferred me over to the other part of the website, but that's not what happened.
Have to do it again.
Well, I didn't make the same mistake anyway.
Okay, you're logged on. What?
So this isn't scripted, right? I mean, this is a site where all this stuff actually happened. So I got some sort of back-end scripting error, right? It says Olay integration server error with some number codes.
Looks like you got some kind of error there.
Oh, you didn't see it? Yeah, it was well, before I got some sort of web error, not telling me. I don't know what it's doing.
So slow websites are an error by themselves, that the website is too slow.
Got an error like that before from this side?
Not that I remember.
What did you do just there?
I just basically told it to start over,
Okay.
try and get it to actually finish loading the page.
Great.
Okay, am I logged on? Yes, so I seem to be logged on. Has my-
So this is a case where the website did something right. I was checking to see if it still remembered me being logged in, and it displayed my name right in the center. It was really easy to find, so I was comfortable understanding that I had already logged in.
in here. And what happened to my order? I guess I have to start.
So what was I just looking for? Something like my cart, something that showed the list of things in my shopping cart. There's actually no apparent button for my cart. So I assume that means there's nothing in my cart, so I'm going to have to start over.
This time I think I'll type in pack H3780. Maybe that'll. Nope. I'll do this again.
So there was a ding again, right? So it's just so natural, even though the website keeps telling me, nope, this doesn't work, nope, this doesn't work, nope, this doesn't work. I'm still going to keep doing it just because it's just too natural and learned response.
Go down to where we found it before. I don't know. Oh, it's 38.7 again. Number. And here we go. Add to cart. Same as before. Should have all this in automatically, but it doesn't.
So what's the breakdown here?
You expected autofill.
Right. So I obviously have an account with these people. I've ordered stuff from them before, and somehow it's leaving all these fields blank, right? So obviously it should know my shipping address and everything. Maybe not my credit card, but certainly the shipping address. There's no reason not to remember that.
Type it in again. There is a problem processing request. Please name your shipping address. Title.
Okay, so please provide an address, and it made this field red, and it put a star on it. So, that's pretty obvious. It's probably the right way to provide it. I didn't actually tell it where to ship it to. It's perfectly reasonable error. The first one, on the other hand, is really confusing. Please name your shipping address. So let's see what happens. Okay, so this label says title. It's in red, so I have to fill something in there. What did I think it meant? My title, right? Doctor, professor, or something like that. What did they actually want? Right, so they wanted the name of the shipping address, like work was what they were going for, work versus home, right? But remember, the error message said, please name your address, and the prompt says title, which are not the same. So there's a consistency error. This is also just a really confusing. If it had said name of address, nowadays it probably would have a checkbox work, home, other, or something, just to avoid this kind of confusion, right? It turns out it's perfectly happy having a doctor as the name of the address, so it has no way of checking whether this makes sense or not.
Why don't you take this away?
So obvious scripting bugs, right? So it lost some of the information I had already put in. It turns out in web pages it's actually a lot of trouble to remember all the things that you filled in already. And the programmers are just lazy and did it wrong. Anybody see another error that's coming up in a second?
They lost the state.
Lost the state too, right? So I have to do all this again. There's absolutely no reason for any of these errors. It's just sloppy programming. And you'll see that a lot. I mean, one of the problems with taking this class is you'll never be able to look at products again without realizing how sloppy they are, or how the designer should have actually paid more attention and made stuff work better.
Okay. Whoa, look how this different ways of shipping it. UPS found, FedEx found, UPS 3 days, 2 days.
So it's just a flat list. It's actually 90% of these don't apply to almost everybody because they're all about business to business.
Next afternoon. Well, that's interesting.
Now, when you're ordering,
So obviously, too many shipping addresses is a problem. Another thing that was a little weird is I went all the way down to the bottom to click OK, even though there was, it turned out, a checkbox at the top. A button at the top.
from the site, do you frequently have a deadline
Okay.
by which you need to get it?
Not usually. Usually it's just something that we need, in the next few days. And the next day, like I said, is okay. Well, let's pretend I typed in my credit card thing. Oh, I can phone in. And probably will fail. Yeah. So,
we
I
can
can type in my number and
Right.
it would probably work from here.
All right. Wait a second.
OK. Oops.
Please be working.
OK. So there's no necessity. Typically the last button is buy it, right? So if you're doing an e-commerce site or something, there's no need to make them actually pay any money, right? If you want to make them buy something, then you should pay for it for them. But if they happen to want to buy something, it's fine to observe it. But the nice thing about websites is that's usually the last step, and you've pretty much gotten all the information you need by then. So you can just ignore the last step. OK. So there's a lot of information about this particular scenario that you can go back and watch the video again. I've collected all the screenshots of all the interesting parts of the video if you want to look at those. And what we're going to do now is go through the rest of the things you're supposed to do for the homework, the different diagrams, and show how you would display all this information. So the reason that we recommend these diagrams, or they're called graphical models in the book, is as a way of summarizing the information in a much more concise and you can almost always get it into a single page, right? So it's a really concise way of summarizing all the information and to help you get insights. So the quote is, opinions are cheap, but insights are priceless, right? So everybody has opinions. Oh, I think this should be blue. I think this should move over here. But if you actually have data as a result of these kinds of actual uses, then you can do a much better job of redesign. The graphical presentations that we are requiring you to do for this homework are the ones that have proven to be particularly useful. So the number one most useful thing is actually watching the user. So there's really no substitute for doing a user study. And there are a variety of ways of representing the information. So in assignment 1, we're going to have you do these diagrams. In assignment 5, I think it is, you're going to use a different kind of table to represent your findings. And so in addition to teaching you different methods, we're teaching you different ways of representing the information. And these diagrams have proven to be particularly useful ways of summarizing a lot of information in a very small space. Now, in a real situation, you'll have multiple users, you'll have multiple investigators, and it's a lot harder to go from the data to the diagrams. And so there's a step in between, which we're not doing for this homework, where you're trying to basically analyze the information, to organize it, to try and understand what's going on. And typically one does that by making these affinity diagrams, which often will take the form of sticky notes put on a big wall, or a big display like this. And if you walk over to South Craig Street where our master students are, you almost always find walls full of sticky notes. And that's one of the reasons that we put them in these rooms where they can stay in the same room for a long period of time, because then they can put them up on the wall and leave them up for a while as they're trying to understand their data. And so these are called affinity diagrams, and that's because these are all a bunch of things that happen that are related. They have some affinity to each other. And then the blue stickies are a name for a category or a grouping. So this is a way of organizing, did all 3 of our users or 7 of our users have the same problems or different problems? Did they have the same problems on different parts of the interface? So as a way of kind of organizing your data, taking these, writing each problem on a sticky note, putting them on the board, having a group exercise where you group them together as a group. And that's one of the reasons to use a great big board instead of a computer program, is because then you can kind of all stand around it together and collaborate on this. In this homework, we're skipping this step. We only have 1 user. We don't have any extra time anyway. So you're just going to do your diagrams directly from the data, from the transcripts. And there are a variety of models or diagrams. The homework includes the first 3, the flow model, the social model, and the artifact model. But there are a bunch of others that may or may not be useful. We don't assign them in this homework anymore. And there are even more. Besides those 5 that I'm going to talk about in this lecture, there's a whole bunch of other ones that, if you're interested, you can read about in the textbook. And there's even the possibility of doing these same kind of models for your new design. We're not going to bother with that either. Right? So you're just going to do a model based on what you actually observe. And so that's the number 1 requirement for your models, is they show what actually happened. So that goes to this big point in red. You're not allowed to make things up. Everything on your models has to have actually happened. Okay? And one way we're going to tell is that you have to label everything with either the time code or the line number to show where it came from in the transcript. And that also, sometimes you're wondering, I wonder what the context of this statement was, or what were they trying to do when they had this error. You can go back to the transcript and read exactly what happened in that, at that time period. Hopefully, you'll all find a bunch of breakdowns or barriers, problems. These are all the same thing. And these typically would be marked with red with some kind of lightning bolt or squiggly line or something like that. That's obviously an opportunity for redesign. So in addition to the scenario we just saw on CDW on the website, another example is in this paper, which is basically a conference call. So there's this room, a conference room, with a big round table, and there's a whiteboard, and the presenter is over here. This is the presenter, and here's the computer with a wired mouse, which the presenter is having a hard time reaching. And there are microphones around the room and cameras for the remote participants. So this is a collaborative meeting between Pittsburgh and I think it was Germany. So there's a variety of interesting things that happen in this conference call. So the number 1 diagram you have to make is called the flow model. And this is a little confusing for people. It's not a sitemap. Okay, so you shouldn't show me all the different pages of your website or of your phone or whatever. It's about information flow. It's also not a flow chart, if you know what that is. A flow chart is a sequence of things that happen with conditionals. If this, go this way, if that, go the other way. It's not that either. It's about how the information flows from the user to the device. And typically, your device will be 1 bubble. So you'll have a 1 bubble for CDW, 1 bubble for your camera, 1 bubble for whatever you're doing, the Giant Eagle checkout system. And then there'll 1 bubble for the user, and there'll be lots and lots of lines to show the information flow between the user and the system. And the key thing you're trying to catch are the key roles, the key people involved, and the flow of communication between them. And to the extent that any physical thing is used, that's called an artifact, then you would put that on the diagram as a box. So people are circles and stuff are boxes. And obviously, you want to have lots of breakdowns. Right, so the circles and little icons, if you want, you don't have to, are people. Boxes are for artifacts and stuff. Arrows show the flow of information, so from the user to the website, from the website to the user, things like that. Breakdowns, time codes. If you've observed something interesting that didn't actually happen, it's okay to represent that, but you have to mark it specially. So the A for assumption, you know, the user really was confused at this point. Or I really think it should be better in blue. So if you've come up with some cool idea that you don't want to lose, you can certainly put it in the diagram as long as you mark it clearly. And it's not, however, about your opinions about the user interface. So in a later assignment, I think it's 5, maybe 4, you are actually going to use a different evaluation technique where you get to say your own opinion, but this is not that technique. So your opinions don't go in this diagram. It's just what the user actually said and what the user actually did. So the A is about assumptions about what the user did, and you as the experimenter or the interviewer are never in any of these diagrams, right? Even though you told the user to do something, we're pretending for the sake of this exercise that they came up with that on their own. Okay, so no interviewer in the diagrams. So the key things in the flow model are, you know, how the information goes back and forth, who decides things, who tells somebody to do something, how do various people are involved in this mechanism, and who's in charge. So here's the example from CDW. Hopefully you can read it. So I'm here in the middle, the user, and my role is purchasing equipment for students. And then at the very beginning, there was this little exchange about all these other people, and so we wanted to capture that. So sometimes my secretary gets stuff, whoops, and sometimes students ask me for things, so this arrow goes this way, from the students to me. Sometimes I request the computing facilities to buy things, so that arrow goes the other way. Remember, at some point, I look things up in a file, and so that's a square, because it's an artifact, it's a thing that I used, it's not a person. And here's an assumption that the experimenter made that that was a bad thing to do. Right? I didn't say that, so he couldn't put a number with that was a bad thing to do. But the fact that there is this file, the experimenter thinks that's not secure, so that's a problem. So he wanted to make sure he didn't lose that, and so he put an A there. Now, there's 2 bubbles here for CDW, and that's because the website itself is trying to tell me that there are 2 different websites. Right? So if you remember, there was this big distinction between the 2 different versions, 2 different website names, and so in the user's mental model, there should be these 2 websites. So that's why there's 2 circles. To the extent that your device is trying to present itself as a unified whole, then you'd only have 1 circle. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the user's mental model and, you know, each of these sites is a whole bunch of pages, but that's really not represented here. Question?
You have multiple different elements in the site. Should you break them out or use them as artifacts? Or how would you represent that?
Right, so the question is,
like a menu or
right, so all websites have multiple sections. There's menus and search screens and search results and product lists and all sorts of things. And typically you would not separate those out in the flow model, because in the user's mental model, it's all one company, one website. In the same way, if you're using a camera, right, the camera has a million different screens, and you go from screen to screen, and it has a main menu, and it has 12 buttons on the back. Again, that's all one artifact. It's all one system, and so there'd just be 1 bubble for it. So it's if the user's supposed to have a mental model of these as different things, or sometimes people actually do use different things. So there's a lot of cases on the web where somebody will say, even though I'm at a Rite Aid site, I'm going to use Google to search for this medicine. And I'll type in to Google Rite Aid, you know, aspirin. Or maybe they'll use Google to look up something, and then they'll go back to the website and type it in. Well, then you'd clearly have Google and your website as two different things, because they're in the user's head, they're different anyway. Okay? So it's a little bit ambiguous. It basically depends on the user's mental model, how they're thinking of this in terms of systems or of things. The Giant Eagle, the checkout system, there's a bunch of different machines. There's a credit card machine, and there's this big screen, and there's a scale. I think that'd probably still be, well, maybe you would have two things for that, for the big screen and then the credit card machine, because they really are very separate. And at some point it says, look over there. Time to put your credit card in this other thing, and then come back here when you're done, right? And so in that case, again, probably the user's mental model is there's this credit card thing which is kind of separate from the checkout thing. So it's a little bit ambiguous, but generally all of the pages for one thing are in the same, would be in the same system, same bubble. Okay, so what happened? Search results, I sent stuff, I sent search terms up and I got back no results. Products came back, the order went this way. I typed in the username and password, but it didn't work. When I typed in my email address, I was redirected. So here's an example. There's typically another question of what level of detail to put on these, right? And so the answer, again, it's not particularly satisfying, and you'll probably find this frustrating, but it's whatever helpful, right? And so we're not asking you to put in every single keystroke that somebody typed, because that would be, too much stuff and not a bit helpful. And so there's this one big arrow for shipping and billing information with a whole bunch of breakdowns on it, right? And so it seemed like it was most useful for this to just take that whole page and all the problems with it and group it into one transaction. But if you wanted to have that separate for the shipping part and the billing part and things like that, then that would be reasonable as well. And so there's a bunch of other errors and so forth that happened, shown here on the flow diagram. Here's another flow diagram from the textbook. It looks kind of different. So in terms of, which drawing program you use and what colors to use and things like that, that's fine, whatever you want. I actually drew this in PowerPoint, but you could use Illustrator, or you can even use pencil and paper if you want. As long as you're neat, we can read it. So this is kind of the same idea. Oh, this is for the remote audience, the conference room situation. So here's the presenter in the middle. And he's interacting with whiteboards and the projector and the video camera and screens and another projector. So there are all these physical things, and that's why they're boxes that he has to interact with. There's a local computer, which is running some software, and there's a remote computer. And so there was all sorts of problems with audio. One problem with this diagram is that there's no time codes on it. So you need to have time codes in your example. This is also a scenario that I actually provided to Rex. So he didn't actually have the time codes because I didn't mention them. So lots of good information flow back and forth. Any questions about the flow model? Okay, it's usually pretty straightforward. The questions that you guys have been asking are kind of the key things to keep in mind. How to decide what's in bubbles and how to make sure that the right level of information is on the lines. The social model, on the other hand, everybody's confused about. It's actually kind of tricky, but one way to think of it is it's where you put anything that doesn't go on the flow model. It's all about people's opinions, the influences, the context, anything that helps the user decide why to do stuff or when to do things. Anything that the user has an opinion about should go on the social model. And not too much about what actually happens, except to the extent that it influences people's, why people do things. So it's Byron Holtzblatt called a cultural model. It's kind of the old name for it. It's things like organization, family, business, goals. What do you value when you go to a website or when you buy something? Culture is pretty invisible. Like if you go and ever visit a friend at work, how do they decide how to do things? You can't tell by looking around, right? So these are things that you actually have to ask questions about in order to find it out. And people may not even be really aware of it too much, so you have to ask questions. The quote is, "Culture is invisible as water is to a fish." Right? So the fish is just in it all the time, so he doesn't really recognize aspects of it. So what do you care about in terms of culture? And the social model is formal and informal policies. So this is in a business context, or it might be in a family context. So if you're doing something for families, how do they decide what to do, when to do it, who gets to decide things in a business, what is the business value, the power of individuals over each other, who gets to decide what, values of company and teams. And this kind of power thing, you may think is just obvious and you would use the org chart, but that's often not the case, right? So when my students are trying to make an appointment with me, it turns out the students often have a more packed calendar than I do because of classes. And also I can move meetings, and I don't expect students to miss classes. So even though you might think I'm way higher in the org chart than a student, it's actually the student who gets to decide when meetings are, right? And so this is an example where the kind of culture you care about, if you were doing a meeting planning system, you would say, oh, well, the most senior person gets to decide, but actually, typically it's the most busy person gets to decide, or the person with the most immovable events, right, who can't actually rearrange things. So you have to kind of ask about these informal policies, the informal rules, because you can't just make assumptions about it. So this goes back to the key rule that I keep emphasizing, that you're not allowed to make stuff up, which includes don't make assumptions about things that would go on the social model, right? So you actually have to ask. And so this is one of the reasons that we're making sure you put in a transcript and that you refer everything back so that you're actually designing from real data and not just from assumptions about what probably happens or what should happen, because that's often not true. The group sense of identity and domain, motions. So this is a great place to put what people feel about stuff. Oh, I don't like this website. Oh, this camera is too confusing. Oh, it's too heavy. So things like that are people's opinions or their preferences. All that kind of stuff goes on the social model. If this is a device that you're carrying around, people might say, oh, my friends are going to think I'm a geek if I carry this around too much. Or this camera is way too heavy, I'd never carry it around. Or when I go to the Giant Eagle, I never use the self-checkout because it beeps at me all the time and I don't like to look stupid, right? So these are some of the kinds of contextual reasons why things happen. You want to try and capture that and put it on the social model. Question?
So when you speak about culture and deciding the different types of influence, are we focusing more on the user itself or the organization in which you're designing the device for? Because there's also the culture that goes behind.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're building a kiosk for Giant Eagle or for the airlines, the person who's actually paying for it is not the person who's going to be using it. And so the question is, well, whose culture do you care about? And the obvious answer is everybody's, right? And so to the extent that you can find out about the culture of the person paying for it, that's really great to include as well. So you probably in real life have a different interview because you can't really find that out from your user test. But to the extent that you can find out that, oh, Giant Eagle is the low-cost provider, and so they want to seem really sensitive to low prices, whereas if you're making one for Whole Foods, they are particularly not focusing on price, but on quality, and so they're the quality purveyor and not the low-cost purveyor. So to the extent that you have information about that, even though it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the user in front of you, that would be great to capture and try and represent on the social model. Is that what you were wondering about?
So we're focusing more on the user. I just don't see the word user on the slide, so I wasn't sure if it was, that's what we're focusing for this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously for this assignment, for real, in real situations, you would do more than one person. And you would probably have representatives from the vendor, the person that's actually going to pay for it, as well as people from who are actually users. So how do you do a social diagram? So one is you'd have circles for all the people, again, the influencers. Most people will have thought bubbles where you put their opinions about stuff, and that comes out of the people. So it looks different than a flow model because it'll have these thought bubbles. And there are arrows and directional arrows like the flow model, but these arrows are different. They represent influences or commands. And typically they're worded as commands like, give me good prices, or show me the list of items, or I want you to do this. So because they're influences, they're worded differently than information flow. And there are breakdowns on this diagram as well. Situations where things don't go smoothly, or somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, or negative values. So in your particular situation, where you're doing appliances or devices, you'll want to put down anything you can find out about the context of use, what other people might influence things, people's feelings about whatever you're evaluating. And I can't say this enough because somebody's bound to make that mistake. So here's an example from CDW. The user's in the middle. And my thought bubble is I want to get the right unit. Reliability is important. Good prices are important. Okay, so this all comes out of the interview at the beginning of the video before we even started using the site. Similarly, most of this other stuff is also from the beginning. I said that computer facilities, I want to handle my large purchases. So again, the arrows are expressed as commands of what they're supposed to do. And this really doesn't need to be an A because I specifically said they'd take too long. So there probably could be a time code there. Secretary sometimes gets things wrong. CDW, I said I valued reliable service and good prices, and so there's an arrow to that. So in this case, it's the same bubble. I didn't separate it out into two bubbles, and that's pretty much because it would have been the same thing anyway, so why bother? Okay. So again, it's kind of the same issue that in terms of level of granularity, it's whatever's useful. You know, how can you capture the stuff that you learned at the right level of detail? And here's from the group thing. So we have the audience, and we divided it into two parts, the local audience and the remote audience. The remote audience is thinking, I'm worried that I will miss something that only the local audience gets. The local says, I hope the software and the equipment work. The presenter says, I'm a little nervous about presenting. I want to communicate clearly. I hope I can answer their questions. I don't want to look bad in front of others. Right? So all of this information came from the interview of what people were thinking, of why they were participating. And none of this really makes sense in the flow diagram. Right? So a key requirement is that everything you discover goes on at least one diagram. So if it's something that happens, you can put it in the flow diagram. If it's an opinion, you can put it here. But it's not necessary to put everything on all diagrams. So you discovered a million things that were broken. They don't need to go on the social diagram, right? Because they don't have anything to do with people's opinions about each other. And some of the stuff that's on the social diagram wouldn't go on the flow diagram either. A few things can be in both places, that's fine, but you certainly don't want everything in all places. The breakdowns, remote audience can't hear. And again, these are expressed as commands. Tell us what you're doing, give me feedback, and so forth. Okay? The third model is the easiest of all. It's called the artifact model. An artifact is something that was made by somebody. Usually it's physical things. So a credit card, a notepad, a piece of paper. In the Giant Eagle, there are all sorts of artifacts, right? There's the cans, and there's the screen, and the width scale. Okay, so all of these are different artifacts. In a computer product, we usually think of artifacts as the screenshots, as the different screens that are presented to the user. And the kind of things that you capture screenshots for is to show which parts worked well or worked poorly. Okay, so that you would capture any kind of aspect of what the user is using or creating in order to understand what's going on. So for typical computers, you can probably go back and repeat what the user did and capture screenshots. Or if you recorded things as they were going along, you can just take screens out of the recording. If you're doing a physical device, then you'll probably have to take some pictures of it. But usually, it's not too hard to get high enough resolution pictures that you can see what's going on. And you can annotate it with observations. So this is a screenshot of the search results page, and the breakdown is the search results are too long, and the category label should start with a differentiating word. All right, so if you remember that breakdown during the video, right, it's much easier to understand that if you see a picture of it. So one of the goals of the artifact model is to give the person reading your report an understanding of what happened, of what things look like. And it's fine to include more artifacts, more screenshots. It's also fine to put multiple errors on the same page. So probably, there's a bunch of different things you could say about this screen. And you might as well just put them all on the same screen. Right? So the one I noted here was, this is a confusing label pointing to the title. Right? And so this, for screenshots, basically having one screenshot for each page of your system where something interesting happened. Again, if nothing interesting happens on that page, you don't have to worry about it. And if multiple things happen, you can just label them on the same picture. This one up here is a really low importance problem that I noticed. It turned out, you probably didn't even notice this go by. Anybody notice this? The add to cart button moved from the top to the bottom. It had no impact on the user's ability to do the task, but it did seem a little weird in reviewing it. There's no particular reason it should have moved. It has a different icon, right? Slightly different design for no apparent reason, right? Changed color from clear to red. So that seemed kind of weird. But it didn't have any impact on anything, but might as well make a note of it. There's some more models that I'm just going to explain because they may be of interest. And a few of you are doing devices in the wild. They're in, that aren't on a computer. So the physical model is how the environment actually impacts what you do. So a few years ago, we did a review of a X-ray technician who was studying, it was for General Electric, which made this console that the technician was required to use. And they were worried because all their technicians were getting RSI from sitting at this terminal all day using the mouse. And so we went to look at the physical environment, and it turned out there wasn't really enough desk space to use the mouse because they needed these big piles of physical charts from the patients. And so the big charts would come down and to be this giant pile, and they'd have to take it and put it in front of them and in order to look at what they were supposed to look for. And then they didn't have enough room for the mouse, and so they were using it in an awkward way. And so in that case, the physical environment was really relevant to the problem. right? And similarly, if you're doing the Giant Eagle one, probably the physical environment of the checkout is going to be really relevant. Not so much for websites, right? It doesn't really matter where you're sitting when you use a website. So it's rarely important for the devices that we do in this class, so we don't require it. But if you think it's relevant for your particular case, you'll get a few extra points credit. You get a few extra credit points for including it. So it's things like the placement of items around where you're doing stuff. If you're at work, proximity of printers, the fact that if you're doing a camera, and you need to point to the back of the camera because it's a touch screen, but you have something else in your hand, or if it's winter time and the person's wearing gloves and so they can't use this device because it doesn't work with gloves on, things like that would all be relevant to include. So the physical model are places in which this happens, physical structures which are relevant to doing the task, movement of things throughout the space. So to the extent that somebody has to go from one place to another or do things in different places, the layout of tools around the task, and so forth. And of course, breakdowns that have anything to do with the physical layout. So for the CDW, there was no physical layout. There's nothing to draw for that. But on this conference call, it was really relevant, right? So there was a breakdown in that the presenter couldn't really reach the mouse because it was over here on a wired mouse, right? And so the fact that there was this separation was really important, and you really would only see that as a result of drawing this diagram. And obviously, there's an obvious fix, which is use a wireless mouse or a quick clicker, right? So that comes directly out of noticing this. Microphones are not working. Another thing that you see from this diagram, it turns out that there was a room over here, and people kept walking across in front of these guys in order to get to this other room. There wasn't another way in, right? And so the fact that this was a traffic lane was a breakdown in terms of letting people understand what was going on. Probably is not relevant to the redesign you're doing, but it's something you noticed, so it should go on a diagram somewhere, right? And so this probably only appears on the physical diagram because it probably wasn't something anybody mentioned during the context, during the interview. And then finally, there's another diagram called the sequence model, which we're not doing in this assignment at all because it turns out to be almost 100% redundant with the transcript and the flow model. But a sequence model is basically a flow chart of everything that happens. First this happened, then this other thing happened, then this other thing happened. Not very interesting if you have a transcript, but you can use it to summarize at a higher level of abstraction the steps that went on. So it's the steps, the triggers, which are why things happened, what caused it to start doing this next phase. And typically the triggers let you group things into different subtasks. Right? So first I was trying to do a search, and then after that I was trying to put things in my cart, and then after that I was trying to buy things. So it's kind of the different categories of activities. The intent or why you're doing things again, and then you can show the steps, and of course the breakdowns. The key reason to make a sequence diagram is to have a higher level of abstraction than the transcript. So obviously, if you just repeat everything in the transcript, it would be silly to waste all the space to make a diagram. But you can use very high-level summaries of what happens. But again, the level that you do depends on what you want to know. Right? So if you're thinking about, say you have files in a folder, in a file folder, and the user opens up one in order to write a new letter. So you could say, at the functional level, he finds the most recent letter written to the same person, opens it, deletes the date, replaces it with a new date, deletes the contents, and type new contents. So that's typically how I send new letters to people I've already written letters to. Is I find the last letter to them, and then I update things. Right? But if you were interested in how do people find things in the folders, this doesn't tell you how I found things in the folders, but it would tell you all about how I create new letters. So it depends on what you were interested in. If you're working on text editing and folder management, those are very different needs and very different levels of detail that you'd want to know. So if you're Microsoft working on how do people use folders, then you might want the second level, which says I switch Windows Explorer to the details view and I sort files by date, and then I double click on the top item. Right? So totally different level of detail would help you understand a different part of this task. Which part should you focus on? It entirely depends on what you care about in this particular redesign. If I'm only working on Microsoft Word, I'm not going to change anything about the folders, well, then this is totally irrelevant. So it's all about which ones to review. So here's this sequence diagram for the CDW situation. You notice this giant loop. So again, this is a level of abstraction, right? I did something once and I did pretty much everything again. It wasn't identical, right? There were some little differences, but for the purposes of this summary, those differences are not really important. And so this gives you a nice understanding that, well, you had to do the same thing over and over again, which is kind of the key point. And there are more models in the textbook if you care, but they're not on the homework or in the exam, so you don't have to care. So they come up with something called a task structure model that tries to get at tasks and subtasks, and we talked about this in a previous lecture, is how do you understand the tasks and the pieces of the task, subtasks. And obviously you kind of need to know what tasks you want to make your interface support. So it is useful to understand the different tasks and to characterize them. So this may be useful to you in some situations. And it focuses, again, on what you need to know and not how, right? So the key, when you're going from problems to design, there's a middle step where you try to characterize the requirements in a way that leaves you flexible to think of different ways of solving those requirements. And so that's what you're trying to capture here is the tasks in terms of the domain, like edit a new letter or buy a new smartphone, right? It doesn't say anything about how I'm going to do that task, but as part of buying a new cell phone, I'll need to find the right cell phone. I'll need to enter my username and password to log in. I'll need to, give it the purchasing information. So at that level of detail, you can understand the tasks and the subtasks. You can also capture the information needs. So the system needs to have my name and address, or it can't ship it to me. It needs to have this, and so forth. But it doesn't give you any information about how you have to do that in the interface. And so this is their example from a different scenario where you're buying tickets. And they've shown this breakdown of the tasks at the different levels. So pretty straightforward. And the key challenge for these is often how deep to go, how much detail to provide on each task. So how do you create these models? In real life, you would have multiple people. And so typically, and actually somebody asked this question, is you typically would have one model for each device. And often the way you'd have to get there is you'd have one model per user, like you're going to make in this class, and then you'd combine those into what's called a consolidated or aggregate model across all people. For this homework, you're just going to have one model for one person for one system. And so you'll basically turn in 3 models. Well, artifact model will have lots of pages, one for each screenshot or whatever. Typically, the flow model will fit on a single page, but you can make it a little bigger if you need to. And similarly, the social model will typically fit on one page. In real life, you would probably have one model per user, and then you would consolidate them and also have a consolidated model. And then eventually, in the next assignment, you're going to use these models as the data that helps you understand how to make your designs. So you'll want to try and simplify the interface by reducing flows. Obviously, you're going to try and get rid of all the breakdowns you discover. You'll try to understand what people don't understand so that you can do things in a better way. What parts of the interface are confusing, which labels don't make sense. All those kinds of things should come right out of the models, and then you'll be able to design better. OK, ended pretty much on time. And homeworks are due before class on Wednesday, so before 1:30, so no one has a good excuse to miss class. And on Wednesday, we'll start talking about the next homework and what to do with that.